Okay, good morning and afternoon, wherever you are. Thank you for joining our COVID-19 discussion series. My name is Alyson Gaffney, and I'm the Executive Director for CNAR, the Canadian Network of Agencies for Regulation. With the announcement of late regarding physical distancing, limiting travel, we've decided to create these discussion series. This is our number 3 on virtual proctoring. This was created based on the amount of response we received in our first discussion, which was on examination. So today we have a phenomenal panelists, but before I introduce them, I just wanted to give you some housekeeping notes. Because of the tremendous response, we received 195 registrants for this discussion. We have had to coordinate via a panel of experts. So all participants are muted, but you can pose questions via the chat line, which should be in your bottom right-hand corner, okay? And we'll monitor the chat and try and bring those questions to the panelists. This call is being recorded, and which we will then post in our coming weeks on our CNAR website and plus onto our YouTube channel. After this discussion, we will also be sending back to you for survey response and questions. Okay, so let's get started. I'm thrilled to introduce our panel. So starting with Isabelle Gonthier, she is President and Chief Operating Officer from Yardstick Assessment Strategy and one of our key partners. Sean Mathias, Account Executive and Country Manager with Prometric Canada, also one of our top partners. We have Christine Nielsen, CEO, Canadian Society for Medical Laboratory Science, one of our leading regulator, and Greg Pope, Director of Examinations, Association of Professional Engineers and Geoscientists of Alberta. And finally, but not lastly, or leastly, John Wickett, Principal at Wickett Measurement Systems Corporation. So let's get started. Let's talk with the regulators and if you could give us, Christine, just give us an insight as to what's happening. What are you seeing and the demand and impact of COVID-19 is having on you and your potential move towards virtual proctoring?
Okay, thank you. So the Canadian Society for Medical Laboratory Science runs 3 high-stakes exams for medical lab technologists 3 times a year on a single day. And we've now moved to computer-based testing. So we have like fixed testing for the day. And I run 1 low-stakes certification for medical lab assistants. And we moved to computer-based testing just a year ago. And in the lead up to computer-based testing for the CSMLS, we had heard these fancy things called remote proctoring, and we're like, no, that's not for us. Thank you, I'm interested in it. But you know, the move to CBT is big enough right now. Remote proctoring is probably not right for us at the time. And we work under contract to the regulatory bodies in medical lab science across Canada. So any big changes happening at CSMLS need to have the support of the regulatory body community so that they know and trust the information that's coming out of the CSMLS when they get the high stakes exam results. So we've kind of kept it in the background, though. We've never not talked about remote proctoring, but when we talk to our regulators and we've talked to our own board of directors at the CSMLS, it's been this fantasy, like years from now, maybe we'll be interested, but we're not ready for that yet. And right now we're getting ready for our largest test administration in June. And so far our tests are scheduled. We're not sure if we may have smaller gatherings of people, so we may need to split our numbers. And you know, if we normally have say 20 people in test center, we'll only have 10, and that may impact availability. So we're proceeding as if the June exam is happening, but we're also being very realistic and saying, you know, we may need to move into remote proctoring sooner rather than later. And having an unregulated occupation, the medical lab assistants with a shorter exam might be a great place for us to pilot remote proctoring in the very near future as well. And there will be policy decisions we have to ask, such as, does everyone have to do remote proctoring, or do they choose to do it, and for how long? So those will be conversations we have with our regulators if we get to a point where we're ready to move into remote proctoring. And we've been making sure that we're keeping our eyes and ears open to sort of best practices, who's doing it, you know, and really trying to address our personal concerns with things like security, identification, you know, how do we know people aren't cheating the system or attempting to cheat the system. So we've been attending webinars, talking to our partner in testing, and we've sort of let our regulators know, because we've been in touch with them. They always want to know what's happening with testing, with some written communication just to say remote proctoring, there will be more information coming soon because we together may need to make this decision. So we've kind of been, like, I'll say, laying the pathway for where we might need to go.
Thank you. Greg, can you share some of your thoughts?
Sure, absolutely. So the program that I'm responsible for is the National Professional Practice Exam, the MPPE. So to become a licensed engineer or geoscientist in Alberta and most other Canadian jurisdictions, all applicants have to take and pass the MPPE. And it's a multiple choice exam. It covers areas such as professional practice, law, ethics, and regulation. It's 110 questions administered in a 2.5-hour session. And we have 5 exam session windows throughout the year. We test approximately 4,500 to 7,500 candidates annually. And since 2015, when the MPP transitioned from paper and pencil to CBT, candidates had the option of taking the exam in either brick and mortar test centers or via remote proctoring. Most candidates took the exam in brick and mortar test centers, but where there weren't brick and mortar test centers, say, for example, in isolated areas or remote areas, or people that were deployed overseas, they were able to use remote proctoring. So we've got about 5.5 years of experience behind us in terms of remote proctoring, although at lower numbers in brick and mortar test centers. And actually at the start of the CBT transition, we actually had an in-person proctor and a remote proctor, and we had planned to remove this requirement. And we ended up doing that earlier because we had an administration last week where we removed that in-person requirement and went full remote with the highest level of security. So the decision to make this transition to fully remote for this last April administration last week wasn't too terribly difficult because we did have some experience and we had the infrastructure in place, and with the help of our vendor partner, we were able to pivot in a relatively short period of time. And I'm happy to report that last week's session did go quite well. I can talk more about that later when we start answering questions, but the feedback that we received from candidates was generally quite positive. Candidates really liked that they were able to set up their own environment and not have to go to a test center or risk exposure during this time, and not have to hold up their licensing requirements as well. So in terms of security, we've been monitoring that over time, and we haven't found any incidences of collusion detection or content theft that have been related to remote proctoring, although it has been with lower numbers for remote proctoring to date. We didn't find any collusion detection, collusion flags for this last administration last week, and we're keeping a close eye on that. In terms of performance equivalence, we've also kept an eye on that over the last 5.5 years, and we haven't found any differences between remote proctored versus brick and mortar test center proctored exams in terms of pass rates or test means. So that's something else we've been keeping an eye on. That's sort of the lay of the land right now. We have an upcoming administration in June that likely will also be fully remote proctored, and it's going to have quite a higher volume than the one we had in April. So we're planning for better candidate communication in advance to make sure that candidates and our partner regulators understand the ins and outs and what will happen with technical difficulties, and just to expect things that are going to happen and get ahead of some of the communication issues that we had for this last April.
Excellent, interesting. Thank you very much. Isabelle, maybe I could hand it off to you and you give us a perspective from a different kind of perspective.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's very interesting to hear Christine and Greg for sure in terms of their experience, the process they're going through or have gone through as it relates to online proctoring. There's been obviously a lot of evolution of thinking around that methodology in the industry. And it's interesting from my perspective because I've been in the testing industry for a number of years wearing different hats, you know, from a program standpoint, from a testing vendor executive standpoint. I've done different roles, and looking at the evolution of thinking based on what's now available, the technology, the way things have progressed, also changed my perspective around the around online proctoring as a method from a high stake testing perspective. Even in the past few years, like a year or two, looking at the adoption in the credentialing industry, it's interesting to see, there's many sectors, different types of exams that have adopted online proctoring as an option, or as the method to administer the exams. Different sectors like, with Greg, with engineering, construction sector, IT, food safety, fitness, financial, even some healthcare organizations have adopted in different ways online proctoring. So we can definitely look at benefiting from that experience and understanding that a little better. Even from an accreditation standpoint, if we think about accreditation standards, from a certification standpoint, ISO 17024, they have accredited some programs now that are using online proctoring and vetted those systems against, security standards, psychometric standards. So right now, what's interesting is that the current situation is really pushing the thinking further for programs and organizations that might have dipped their toes a little bit into it, but we're not necessarily feeling confident about it, but now really have to think about this as an option to be able to test candidates, to continue to operate and make sure that, candidates are getting certified or licensed. But really at the same time, it's kind of leveling and making sure that there's key elements that are being considered. And we'll talk about some key questions most likely later on, but, elements around security, identity verification, the monitoring of the environment, what's the proper testing environment, what do you need to communicate to your candidate, what are the systems requirement, equivalency. Greg touched on comparing some data of online proctored exam compared to exams tested in the test centers. How does that look? So we've seen, I've seen that with other programs where we've done some analyses where there's really, from a performance standpoint, no difference. But of course, there's certain elements that we need to keep in mind. But really, I think from my perspective right now, I'll use a say from one of the regulators that I've been interacting with over the past few weeks, is that why waste a good crisis? Let's kind of take that and figure out how we're going to go about this. So, yeah.
Okay. Thank you for that. Sean, can we get your maybe some quick thoughts from yourself?
For sure. So I'll build a little bit upon what Isabelle just mentioned. I think, definitely don't waste a good crisis, because if you were thinking about this in the past, and this was something that was in your 2 to 5 year roadmap, it is now in your 2 to 5 month roadmap, if not quicker. So, I think the element that I want to suggest is that absolutely we've seen a large influx from all across all verticals, whether it's healthcare, medical, finance institutions, accreditation, certification bodies. Everyone's interested in this and providing a solution. Important option for your candidates, important option for your stakeholders. But I'd say there's two sort of important ways to approach it. The first important piece is, frequent, regular communication with your internal stakeholders and the candidate base, making sure they understand the steps you're going to walk them through, and making sure that they feel comfortable in terms of the stability and the reliability you're going to offer them. The second aspect I would say is that regardless of how you decide to proceed forward, proctoring or remote proctoring is the way you are deciding to go, there needs to be really strong collaboration and partnership with the vendor that you do select, regardless of the vendor. And you want to put, pretty much everything on the table in terms of what are some of the, issues that I may potentially face, which we will answer today, and what are some of the things that you want to be thinking about. From a vendor perspective, we see the wide spectrum of clients and their needs. However, as a test sponsor, you're pretty much looking at your needs and your, perspective. So understanding and getting that breadth of experience from a vendor that can work with you is critical to your program, and frequent communication and collaboration is the only way to move forward to be successful. And my last point would be keep in mind that there is the environment that we're currently in provides us with a certain amount of flexibility, and there's pros and cons to this. So things where you typically deal with accommodations that can sometimes be challenging are things that go away because a candidate may not need that separate space, may not need a scent-free environment because now they're testing at home. So some of those challenges that you face or accommodations that take up a lot of your time could potentially also go away. So just some food for thought there.
Excellent. Thank you. I like the fact that everyone's adding a little bit extra information in point. John, we're finishing up with you before we open it up a little bit more. Can you give us some of your perspective that you've seen happening and engaged with?
Great, thanks. I think, first I think I want to point out that I come from a maybe slightly different perspective, and that I don't actually provide administration services at all. So I'm purely on the development and analysis side of this. And that, and so I think that kind of gives me, a slightly different view on this. And I look at this as a choice issue that we have. And I think, Christine, you started sort of this conversation, Isabelle, you sort of also talked about this evolution. And I think it's really, interesting that if we go back 5 years, the main decision you might have had, or even 10 years, was whether you're doing pencil and paper and test center or CBT. And then over the last 5 years, I think absolutely, we see remote proctoring showing up on the scene, so that becomes like a third choice. But suddenly our choice is, and we never even knew we had this choice or had to make this choice, is remote proctoring or no testing. And never has no testing really been on the table as something to consider. But that is what we're all considering, right? That is the reality. You either do this remotely or you do not test, at least for a time period that is unpredictable in its length. And that's the challenge, I think, that programs are really facing. And from my perspective, it's really one of it's a different take on the 3 R's. There's risk, relevance, and revenue. So there are risks, and I think there are certainly Isabelle and Sean, I think, will bring a lot of good information to the table on how some of those risks in terms of security can be dealt with in remote proctoring as a modality. But there are very real risks that need to be considered. And every program, whether they've been doing CBT or pencil and paper or remote proctoring, has been dealing with risk regardless. It's just different risk, different modality is really all we're talking about here. The risks need to be considered in terms of making the decision going forward. There are very real psychometric issues around validity. Equating standard setting can be challenged when you move suddenly from only one modality to a completely different modality. So there needs to some considerations there as you plot that course out. I think the other risk that I'm not sure that I've really heard discussed so much is this element of fair access. There will be candidates who, by the situation they are living at home, or perhaps access to an appropriate internet or computer, I think Sean, you brought up around the idea of sort of audio, the right setup to be able to actually administer remote proctoring. Some may not have that access. There may be, if you have a 3-year-old at home, you're not going to have the 3-year-old stay quiet for the 3 hours you need to take the test. That's not an option, right? So that is, are there people who might be disadvantaged? I think there's things to think through as you go through the process. But relevance, I think, is equally important on the other side. If this goes on long enough and you're no longer testing, are you any longer relevant as a regulator or as a provider of these examinations? If other alternatives are forced upon you, then you cease to be part of the equation, and that's not necessarily obviously a place anybody wants to be. And of course, revenue is top of mind for a lot of folks as well. If you're deferring revenue for 6 months, you can probably weather that storm. If it's longer than that, or the revenue isn't regained, it's obviously another substantial issue. So, I think the answers are not necessarily, certainly clear. Part of it, I heard that we're all amateur epidemiologists now in terms of trying to predict what the future holds for us. But that concept of, if you're going to go down this road, make sure you're going down it with fully evaluating the risks, both in terms of engaging in the activity or in not engaging in the activity before you make that decision.
Thank you. One of the questions that keep coming up, it was across the wonderful thing, we sent out this pre-discussion questionnaire, and without a doubt, I'd say 50% of the respondents, one of the big questions was security. How do you guarantee that nobody's cheating? Basically that, for some reason, that is top of mind. I just wondered, Christine and Greg, just from your experience. And Greg, I think you might have alluded to that you haven't seen a big difference, but as someone said, well, we don't really track cheating because we don't know if they cheated really. So I wondered, is there anything on the security aspect and confidence in the results, if you'd like to discuss that point?
Sure.
Sure.
I can go. Do you want to go first, Christine? Go ahead.
No, you go first.
Okay. When the MPPE was a paper-based exam, test security was certainly an issue, and cheating and content theft were problematic. So when we transitioned 5.5 years ago to CBT, we took a lot of care to try and mitigate these kind of things, and using things like scrambling the question order and implementing more stringent test security measures, as well as regular collusion detection and content theft patrols. And so, although we haven't found test security issues specifically with remote proctoring, I think part of that is probably because of the lower numbers that we've had historically with remote proctoring. I'm sure that in any case or in any way that an exam is proctored, I personally think it's impossible to prevent every test security incidents from happening. There's always sneaky ways that someone could potentially steal content or potentially cheat. But as John was talking about, risk mitigation is the most important thing. We do regular collusion detection analyses, and we haven't had flagged cases for remote proctoring to date. In this last administration in April, we haven't had that. I don't think that any proctoring method is perfect, but in a situation where you're dealing with no testing at all versus testing in the best possible context and situation that you can make, I think that remote proctoring has even some advantages potentially over test centers. One thing that I noticed is that the candidates are able to set up their own environment in terms of the comfort levels and whatnot. They have a sweep of their area so that papers and whatnot are not available to them. They still have all of the lockdown browser elements, so they're not able to access websites or go to other sites. For our program, I feel pretty comfortable about the security. Is it perfect? No, but I don't know if there is a perfect solution.
Thank you. And so while we haven't moved to remote proctoring yet, one of the things that the CSMS was really interested in was trying to figure this out. Like, one of the key things about even moving from paper and pencil to computer-based testing, we were excited about some of the intelligence and the analytics that are built into how fast test takers are answering, some of the enhanced security things that come with just moving to a computer-based testing platform. And then we were pretty excited when we'd seen some demos to see, okay, so a remote proctor who's an expert scans the room multiple times with the candidate, and they're then given sort of a check of approval, and then they're sort of admitted to an exam. And then a remote proctor basically watches a certain fixed number of people for the entire duration of the test, and they can track things like eye movement. They can track, a little whisper off the side. They can see things, and they have the ability to stop the exam immediately and say to the candidate, I'm going to need to scan your room again. And they also are keeping a video. So the great thing about that is, if there's a question, even after the exam, maybe based on data, we can actually, from my understanding, as the test client, ask to see a video for X candidate wherever they were proctored, and work with the vendor to see, is this a legitimate test taker and process that we could put our stamp on. And so those were exciting things for us to see, and to realize that one proctor who's in a room with 25 people may not be able to see eye movements, and yet the computer can through the scanning that it does. Mm-hmm. So we were pretty excited about some of the enhanced security measurements, not just with computer-based testing, but what remote proctoring might be able to give us.
Interesting. Actually, along that theme, and I want to maybe expand the question to Isabelle and Sean, still around the privacy and the security, but also what is, there's a lot of questions around the entire grouping. Who do you have to engage into? How do you get this system going? What are the requirements to get everybody on side and be involved in executing a successful remote proctoring project, let's say, and test? Who would like to start?
Isabelle?
Yeah, I can go. I think I'm going to build on something that you said, Sean, in your introduction, where, the making it happen requires the involvement of all parties involved. So, the testing organization, the vendor, and communication is super critical, because you need to understand, okay, what's happening during the online testing experience. From a privacy standpoint, what's being, people are being recorded. There's a camera. There's information being collected. What is that information being collected? Communicating that in advance, obtaining consent. So all of this needs to be done in advance. So basically, the importance of working together to establish what those requirements are. If there's a need to download a specific software to provide access to the proctor, to the computer, there's so many elements depending on the solution that is being adopted or being considered that needs to be highlighted, documented, communicated, and worked on together between, like I said, all the parties involved. From a privacy standpoint, that comes up a lot. That question comes up a lot because, people are saying, okay, well, I'm in my home, I'm, video camera, how does that work? So of course it's about consent, making sure people know what's being collected, how long it's being stored, where it's being stored. So all of that information, all of these things are important questions to ask, inquire about, and make sure there's compliance, whatever compliance privacy laws have to be abided for. And of course, we know what those are in Canada. Those are all the elements that, not necessarily getting into the details on this call, but are the things that you need to consider and ask about. Sean, I don't know how you want to add to that, but I'm sure you have more to say.
Yeah, so I want to add to two different perspectives. So the first piece would be from a security point. If you were delivering a paper-based or a computer-based environment exam in an environment that either you manage and you deliver yourself or you do with a vendor, when you want to transition to remote proctoring, there's a lot of advantages from a security perspective that remote proctoring brings over that you may not have in the computer-based test hunting environment. So in an environment where you are, testing 25 people in a room and you've got multiple proctors, there's unique different tasks that person has to do versus a remote proctoring environment. Most vendors, platforms have algorithms and artificial intelligence built in to help you with that, to reduce the amount of work that the proctor typically does. The candidates attempting to cheat in a test center environment, because we have so many exams that we deliver as vendors, is very similar. So for the most part, your candidates are coming to test. There's a very small percentage of candidates that are trying to cheat during their exam. And that percentage of candidates attempting to cheat really won't change much in a remote proctoring environment. So for the most part, your people have positive intent and want to test and do their exam. To touch on what is required to be able to get there, to further that point, if you are already in a position where you're delivering a computer-based exam with an existing vendor, the potential to transition to remote proctoring could be quicker. If you are not and you're in a paper-based environment or you're delivering an exam in a different environment and you want to move to remote proctoring, what you want to think about is planning not to have that to be turned around in 60 days, because it's not as simple as a flip of a switch. So keep in mind that your planning processes for when you want to accomplish your actual testing, if you do want to get there, plan in advance, work with vendors, understand what their platform has to offer. Get to see some of the background security processes that tend to ease your mind, saying, I didn't realize this is the depth of security and the extent of how you potentially scan a person's room, which eases your mind on a lot of pieces that typically you don't understand when you're thinking of remote proctoring. So definitely having enough ramp up time is critical, making sure that your actual go date is communicated after you collaborate closely and partner with the vendor and have a lot of communication. And communication throughout the process with internal stakeholders and with your candidates as you go along this process will only help make it better.
Excellent, thank you. One of the questions, we're just looking at the group chat going on. Thank you everyone for asking questions and some of you answering each other. One of the questions for the regulators, what kind of policy changes have you had to make, or have you had to make any, in going from to the virtual proctoring?
Christine, so we haven't moved to remote proctoring yet, but if I could think ahead, we would likely work with both our vendor as well as our legal counsel to make sure that this would be just the same situation where all candidate results are subject to verification, and that we essentially reserve the right to nullify candidate content if necessary. I mean, there's an investigation that takes place, but we would definitely weave this into a policy, but I don't really see it much different than, you know, if a physical proctor catches you cheating.
Yeah, that's exactly. So
Greg?
we have, so for the last 5.5 years, we've made our policies applicable to both remote proctoring or brick and mortar test centers, because as Christine said, cheating is cheating, whether you're doing that in a remote proctored context or whether you're doing that in a test center. Content theft is the same. So we haven't had to change our policies in that regard. The things that we have had to change, or that we changed a bit and are in the process of changing to make more robust, are around the documentation to make sure that candidates and what they expect on exam day is clear. You know, in reviewing the survey results from our exam last week, there were certainly lots of positive comments. In fact, it was interesting to see that we had overall more positive comments in some aspects. Like, we have a question on our survey that says, please rate your experience with the physical aspects of the testing environment, like lighting, temperature, comfort level, noise, things like that. And usually we get candidates rating in the high 80s, low 90s in terms of being positive. And this last session, we had over 97% responded positively, which makes sense because people can control the temperature in their environment a little bit better and that kind of thing. With that said, we also had some negative comments around technical issues encountered and whatnot. And those are the kind of things we want to try and get ahead of in terms of communication. But in terms of policy, we haven't had to make any dramatic changes since we've gone to fully remote this last session and June and onwards.
Okay. John, I want to bring you into this. This is actually just a wider question, but one that was brought up in the feedback that we received was public's acceptance of this testing. If they know, and just because you're a bit of a counterpoint with the panel, do you think the public cares if it was remote proctoring or face-to-face or this change? Do you think there's any perception of a credibility from regarding any organization, whether it's COVID or not, let's say, okay? And then thinking forward.
Right. I mean, I hesitate to speak on behalf of the entire Canadian public, but sure, if asked to do so, I will take that role on. My best guess is that the public doesn't know very much of what we do in general. So I would be more concerned about the credibility of more direct, well, like the public is absolutely a stakeholder, of course, but the education providers, the other professionals, the any government bodies that need to be worked with. Those are, I think, the public to really be concerned with from a credibility point of view. I think it's a good question. I don't know what the true public would have to think about this. I think they probably trust that we're all doing our jobs, and if we say it's okay, it's okay. But I think it's really the other groups that it needs to be considered. And there is, I think, there's still a reluctance on going to remote proctoring for concerns around, primarily the concerns that keep coming up for security, of the test content couldn't be harvested, and of the ability to perhaps cheat or to have a substitute person in place, and so on and so forth. And there are different merits to those concerns. And I think, I'm gonna sort of, also kind of come back to responding to the question on survey on security rather a little bit, is that just as, no two sort of bricks and mortar solutions are of equal security, equal rigor, no two remote proctoring solutions are of the same rigor either. So, if you are looking to go down that road, you can put certain demands on your provider as to what will make you comfortable, in terms of the scores you eventually issue to candidates, the methods that they put in place, that it isn't certainly a one size, sort of fits all or one solution fits all any more than any testing modality has ever been. And I think it's being able to answer those, to come up with what those, to communicate what those decisions are around how you establish security, how you establish confidence in those final, candidate outcomes, where you're going to get the credibility that you need.
Okay. One of the questions is more technical. How do you technically ensure that everything is set up properly? And I'm going to bring this to Isabelle and Sean. And if you could touch also on communications with candidates, because my expectation is even the candidates would have to have a certain level of infrastructure in order to be able to do the remote proctoring. So could we talk a little bit more about the technical aspect for a successful session?
Sure. So I think there's two aspects to it. So the first piece is, making sure that as you work with the test sponsor or the regulator that is offering the test to the candidates, ensuring that they understand the requirements of the exam that they have versus the technical requirements of what is required on a person's home computer or home laptop. So understanding that there is, little integration to reduce your risk based on the type of exam you have. So if your exam has a lot of video versus a simple multiple choice, there's nuances within each exam that you have that could create some potential technical challenges based on how you're delivering that exam. So that's the first piece to it. I think the second piece is also making sure that you provide enough communication in advance to your candidates, letting them know that these are some of the requirements. So, it's a non-starter without internet connectivity, without a webcam, without a microphone. If you don't have those three pieces, then remote proctoring is not possible. To find what are those alternate solutions. So is it a dual modality, because potentially social distancing still offers the option to test in a test center, but a larger percentage of your volume of your candidates would probably want to test remotely. The other piece that a lot of vendors will offer you is the ability to test your technology at home prior to doing your exam. So, understanding what that looks like, if there's a step or a method that way to validate that, not just on exam day, but in advance, how can I test some of those pieces? So vendors will offer that to you as well. And then the final piece is, if your vendor does not have something that they can provide to your candidates, work with your vendor and create a document that walks them through step by step. Whether the candidate reads that document or not is a different story. And that does happen from time to time. I think it's critical to put together that communication, whether you send it to your candidates or your vendor sends it to your candidates. But that is an important document that will help set up the candidate in advance. So it minimizes potential technology risks. It minimizes potential security risks well in advance of testing. Just like how you are seeing us on Zoom video, that's what typically a candidate is getting viewed by so very closely. So candidates that do attempt to cheat, and there's a variety of different ways where we could spend a 1-hour call just talking about that. I think it's important to understand that when they're caught, because of the artificial intelligence and a lot of these platforms from all of the vendors, there is no refuting it, because it's black and white on video captured. So those are some of the things that as a regulator or as a test sponsor, you could work with your vendor to make sure some of the checks and balances that can happen in advance are taken care of.
It's about, just to build on that, it's about setting up expectations. So what to expect for the candidate, whether it's from a technical standpoint in terms of the requirements, as Sean outlined, or, what's the experience going to be and what's the proper testing environment. We've had, it's really interesting, and you would think people would have a better sense of what's a proper testing environment in terms of what not to have around you, quiet space. Some people are attempting to test in their car. We've had that, we've seen that, and it's kind of saying, no, wait a minute here, like what's the proper environment, what to expect, what are your obligations as a candidate to be ready for this, and making that clear. And of course, the testing in the car is not something that's necessarily frequent, but it does happen. And then understanding that, yeah, you need to have the proper internet connection to be able to do that. You need to be able to interact with the proctor. There's the recording happening. So all of that required a certain form of specific minimal requirements from a technical standpoint. And a video camera is a must. We've had people asking, well, if the video camera doesn't work, can we still do it? At least there's still elements of the testing that can happen. And again, from a security standpoint, standpoint, especially when we think about high-stake testing, we want to be able to monitor everything that's going on through the testing experience.
I just want to, just one last comment is that the biggest challenge or the biggest question that comes up frequently, and I'm sure Isabelle can attest to this, is that can somebody capture their screen and can they have background software running that does it? Any vendor will be able to show you that that is the core essence of remote proctoring security. So any vendor that you discuss with has the ability to disable, whether it's background software, and they've done a certain amount of testing to be able to bring the product to market to ensure that a screen captured through a computer, whether it's as simple as controlled print screen or technology running in the background, all of those pieces have to be disabled, and the vendors can speak to you about that as well.
Excellent. I'm going to open this up to whoever is comfortable answering it. Procedures for suspicious activity. Does anybody have recommendations on how to set that up? Do you stop it immediately? Do you give a chance? I'm not going to say anything. Any insight? What are the processes and procedures that you may uniquely have to set up because of proctoring, virtual proctoring?
I can speak to that briefly. So for the MPPE, we have an escalation path, and that's the same for test center administered exams and remote proctoring are very similar. If there's an incident, then the proctor will intervene. In a remote proctored context, the remote proctor will be able to chat with the candidate and tell them to stop the behavior, whatever it is, if they're talking to someone, for example, or if they're turning their head a lot. If that continues, then that's escalated to the vendor. And then I would get a call saying, this is happening, what do you want us to do? And I have the option of stopping the exam, stopping the candidate from continuing taking the exam. If, for example, something comes up where it looks like there's some recording happening, we could have the exam shut down in a matter of minutes as soon as it goes through the escalation process.
Anybody else care to? No?
Yeah, I think most vendors out there, when they show you their platform, have the ability to tell you or show you that the proctors control the exam. So if there is potentially a concern that the exam, the candidate is cheating or something's being recorded or anything of that nature through the artificial intelligence, there is the ability to pause and terminate a live exam. I think as Greg mentioned, as a test sponsor, always work directly and partner with your vendor on those rules and regulations and guidelines, whether it's, 1 strike and you're out or 3 strikes and you're out. The vendor will be happy to show you their policies and procedures of how they generically operate with clients, and then you customize that for your particular situation. So there's definitely an escalation path. There are certain things that are, pretty hard no, and that's where the exam is terminated, and you as a test sponsor are contacted right away on admin day. Or there are certain things where somebody just walk in the background, the artificial intelligence pick that up. How is that managed? What does that protocol look like? So understanding what your vendor is able to offer you will help you in that decision making.
And everything is recorded as well. So there's an opportunity. Of course, there's going to be flags or incidents that will be minor, other incidents that might elevate to a bigger flag and a bigger concern. So there's always the opportunity after the fact to go back and review the testing session and identify if there are absolute real concerns that could lead to having to nullify exam results. So of course, that's going to be the regulator, the testing organization that's going to make that determination based on their policy. But that's one element that's really critical here, is that there's an opportunity to be able to go back, view, assess, and then make a determination in terms of the potential impact on the validity of the results, depending on what happened.
Okay. One final question before I go ahead, John.
I just wanted to sort of add a little bit to that. I think, some of the AI that you can do with remote proctoring is actually quite impressive. Some of the things you can detect, and the ability. I think arguably, like identification, like making sure the person sitting there is still always the same person sitting there for the test is probably better with remote proctoring than it is with an in-person proctor, just because of the ability to use technology. I think that some of the challenge comes in actually in taking action in a high stakes environment. So to nullify someone's results when there was a one-time testing opportunity to get your license because they were looking up to the left too much, or because they were, you know, running through the exam items too fast, the threshold for where that becomes enough to truly nullify versus not is a challenging threshold to set and to stand behind. So that kind of comes a bit back to policies we were talking about earlier, that you need to have a very clear set of policies that you can defend and justify if you're going to, you know, say, this licensing exam that was going to get you your license, we're considering this to be a null event, and you're going to have to wait 3 months to take it again, or whatever the, the case is. But that's the ability to detect it is great, but the ability to take action on it is a different, a different matter, especially in the licensing environment.
Very, very important point. It actually kind of leads into the final question before we sum this up. International students, you're a lot of times you're testing internationally. Think of it from a location, a capability, technical capability, and legislative, because sometimes this is privacy. Or the question is there any issues that you have to now be sensitive to that are unique to, let's say, if you're trying to test somebody who's sitting in India or Philippines or the US, that you now have to consider because you are now videotaping them? Is there privacy, again, legislative issues that, and technical issues, because it's now an international person that you're testing? I'm opening that up also.
Yeah, so on one hand, international testing is made easier with the use of online proctoring because you can test from anywhere in various settings, provided that the basic requirements are met from a technical standpoint. From a privacy perspective, different countries have different regulations. What's critical is to ensure that, if you think about a specific vendor or any vendor, they would have their privacy information published and available. And in most cases, most organizations are dealing with online proctoring at a global level. So they would have gone through the process of vetting their system, their processes from a global standpoint. But more importantly, it's defining what is done and what's not done, and making sure that is made available to the organizations, to the test takers, so they know what to expect from. And that's that aspect around privacy that is really critical, because yes, there's going to be different intricacies, different laws, different regulations across the world, and vendors, like online proctoring vendors, have to be sensitive to that, but they also have to be able to kind of apply across the board from that perspective. So the publication of those privacy regulations or elements is one of the most important points here.
Yeah, I couldn't stress on that any further, other than the fact that a lot of the vendors that are delivering remote proctoring exams globally are probably also may or may not have the ability to do exams globally in test center environments. So if there is a vendor already complying with test center delivery that's typically a recorded session, they would have those privacy laws, as Isabelle mentioned. Pretty much every vendor that's operating on a global platform, whether it's GDPR, whether it's PIPEDA, whether it's ISO approvals from the US, whatever the regulations are, they would need to comply with that. So definitely an important ask when you're connecting with vendors on providing all the privacy requirements, because they'd be happy to do that. So that's an important question to be asked. With regards to the ability to test globally, I think what it does for you is it definitely opens up the challenges that your candidates, and as a result, your administration staff, are typically facing, because candidates that normally would have to fly from India or the Philippines to come to Canada to test, if that is a requirement, because your testing is only offered in Canada, reduces that risk, that effort, and some of those challenges. So on the flip side, what you might want to consider is you may see an increase in volumes, because not everyone can afford to fly, but they could probably afford to buy a laptop and test in those countries. The technical requirements are also important to consider, because internet connectivity, not in every country, in every continent, is very stable. So understanding that aspect of it from your candidate cohort is a critical aspect to being able to test remotely.
Excellent. Anybody else want to experience from a regulator or at all? No? One question interesting that we haven't seen, oral virtual proctoring. Has anybody done this? Is there anything different from doing oral virtual proctoring? An oral test is the question that came.
I guess on
Nope.
that, you
No
know, there's, and I'll just be transparent here. I don't have any specific experience with that per se, but there's other elements to be considered here from an oral standpoint, because again, do you have an assessor that is in place? How do you kind of provide that infrastructure for the assessor to be able to ask questions, document, record? So it really depends. I think there's ways to leverage the technology, but that's probably all I have to offer at this moment in time.
Well, I think there's you've got to be a little bit more innovative in your approach. So, there's technologies out there that let you record and watch later, not live proctoring. So perhaps the approach of an oral exam is you display the exam, you have the person who is being proctored answer those questions, and then you record it and it's watched and reviewed later as part of the scoring mechanism. So there is unique approaches to item types that you could use on vendors' platforms. There's unique approaches to how you can score. It doesn't have to be that you're live examinee in an OSCE situation or whatever it might be, oral exam situation, has to be there at that moment, because as long as the video can be made available at a later stage in time, it's really meant for scoring. If there's an interaction, you would have to just be innovative in how you create your items and create that exam scenario. But there are certainly solutions out there that vendors can provide.
Excellent. So maybe we can do a reverse order, final thoughts, especially since we're in this because of COVID, right? We've accelerated this process. Some people answered that they actually don't want to do this, but they need to do this in order to continue with the examinations and the testing. And then post-COVID, because maybe the students are comfortable with this. Maybe they prefer to be doing this in their pajamas and at home rather than traveling into a site. Just some final thoughts, and maybe I'll start reverse, and I'll start with John. Since I gave you the last time to speak, maybe you can speak first. Just a minute or two closing thoughts.
Sure, great, thanks. I think I want to sort of play off something you just sort of talked about. What if you go remote now, what happens when the restrictions are lifted and people are comfortable going back into the test centers? I think I've heard that a lot, and I don't tend to give it as much weight, I think, as others do. I think you call this a field test or experiment or a trial period to see whether it works or not. There's no obligation to continue with it into the future if you just set it up as such. This is we're going to try it, to see how well this works, and if it works well, we'll use it in the future. If it doesn't, we don't. I think it can be as as simple as that. I think my overall take on this is you've got, as a program, if you were already considering remote proctoring, it makes total sense to accelerate your thinking on that. I mean, the current situation, if you're not thinking about remote proctoring right now, you're not really paying attention to what's going on. I think you have to at least put that on the table to weigh off, does this make sense for us or not? And this is where the challenge comes in. How long is this going to go? If it's 3 months out before we're back in the test centers, then all the effort in modifying policies, candidate communications, getting established with a vendor who can provide this to you, and getting enough notice to candidates. Okay, now we're going to start testing. That's not a period of weeks. That's probably a period of at least a couple months if you're starting with no foundation whatsoever. And that might may or may not be worth the effort, time, resources, and so on that goes into it. But if it makes sense for your program, accelerate your process. I think it makes this is a time certainly to bring that in, but do evaluate if it makes sense for your program. There are very real factors that might mean it doesn't make sense for you. But I think for a lot, it's a very viable solution. And I think it's definitely something we all need to consider these days.
Thank you. Sean.
So yeah, I think I'll build a little bit more on John's point. So you definitely want to be looking at this, but at the same time, you want to be considering that this is not the only solution. Work with vendors and understand maybe it's a dual modality delivery, as Greg had mentioned earlier. Let's offer the candidate cohort, if this is a decision that you decide to make, that it doesn't only have to be remote proctoring, it could be remote proctoring as well as offset by test center testing, and look at all of those solutions. Definitely go through and experience what a demo would look like and understand what remote proctoring looks like, not just from one, but multiple vendors to make yourself feel comfortable. And understand that the security piece, though very important, once you see what it actually looks like, may take away some of those concerns and maybe make you realize there's advantages to it that can help your organization. Remote proctoring was perhaps 2 to 3 years down the road, where something where it would take away the industry and be kind of the key point in the industry. I think we're in a good spot right now where not just the candidates in our world will never perhaps go to what normal was, but it's something important for you to consider as you progress through your organization's next 3 to 6 months of what things would look like for the future of testing.
Excellent, thank you. Isabelle, final thoughts.
Yeah, and I like it's a great segue from a future outlook perspective, because as we think about the technology, as we think of where we're going as an industry, as a testing industry, online proctoring is part of that future for sure. Even thinking about your population of candidates that are going through education program in colleges and universities, a lot of those organizations have moved to some form of online training, online testing, using those technologies, so that those candidates are already familiar and have been exposed to that, and that provides a flexibility. So I think right now there's a lot kind of available to all of you to consider through the crisis and beyond, and it's doing your research, making sure you get the information you need, collaborate amongst each other. I think this what CNAR is doing here with the panels and engaging in conversations, whether it's with other regulators, with vendors, with industry experts. Let's talk about it and let's make the best of this situation that's available to us.
Okay, Isabelle. Oh, I'm sorry, we just did Isabelle. Greg.
Sure. So we'll need to discuss with our stakeholders what will happen going forward with the MPP when exam centers start opening again. Because I think there's going to be a new normal where social distancing continues for an extended period of time and test center availability may be intermittent or backlog. Also, candidates may wish to have the flexibility of remote proctoring to limit exposure, as we may have second and third waves of cases over the next months and years. So I think what will probably happen is it will allow test center and remote proctoring options to continue going forward, with candidates being able to choose. And if they're more comfortable taking the test at a test center in Edmonton, they can choose that. Or if they wish to take it in remotely from their home in Edmonton, that would probably be fine also. I think accommodating the candidate's comfort level and context will probably be part of the new normal. And probably more exam programs will be getting on board with that approach.
It's a great point. Great point. This could go on for another 18 months, right? As the waves. Finally, Christine.
Sure. I liked what Isabelle had noted earlier, which is, it'd be a shame if we don't take advantage of the opportunities given to us right now. The technology's been around for years. We're all at different stages of comfort in adapting or making big sweeping policy changes, like this is how we're going to be for the rest of our lives. But I feel like, I started on an escalator and now I've got a jetpack on, and that escalator is just moving really fast. And I think, as somebody pointed out, this is a zero-sum game. Not being able to test is not an option for most of us. And, it was mentioned before, relevance is important. If my community figures out how to do away with a national certification exam that we've known since 1937, simply because I can't get my technology organized in time, that's the death knell for our occupation. There's reasons why we certify, because not everybody makes it, right? Nobody clears their way into licensure simply because they finish programs. So I think, you know, being seen as an adaptable association that's able to work with our stakeholders, being the educators and the regulators, and even, you know, we talked about the public. Is this accepted? I think they trust us to do a good job. You know, the how is not what they're most concerned about. It's the what. And the what is that a candidate's certified or verified before they're let loose on the market. So I feel like this is a unique opportunity that's going to flex a lot of muscle if we can get it right, you know. And I think the best thing we all know about technology is with every 3 months that pass, it gets better, you know. And so we're going to see the security tighten. We're going to see things improve. Data's going to help all of us make these good decisions. And for sure, that's the thing that we're looking forward to most, is the opportunity, but also just proving and verifying that it can be done.
Excellent. Thank you very much, everybody. Wow, you guys got it in the hour. Excellent. And thank you, Alana, for organizing this for us. So finally, we will be sending out a questionnaire, a survey, asking for everyone's opinion. Please complete it. It really helps us tighten up this virtual discussion program that we've launched. And please let us know what else we should be bringing to you. Thank you again, panelists. It was wonderful.
Thanks.
Have a great day, everybody.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. All right.
Bye-bye.